Welcome to Propaganda Loves You, the show that asks and answers the question, why doesn't Pete Buttigieg have a bot army? I'm Cody, your host for this week, joined by Noah and Joe.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Welcome back to Propaganda Loves You for this week. We've got two kind of big segments for this week. First segment, we want to talk about, we spent at least one episode each for the last 2 weeks. I think both of our Thursday episodes for the last 2 weeks, we've been talking about the current Epstein controversy and what that's doing right now in context of the Trump administration, the narratives that they're pushing, how they're trying to control the messaging around that. Today, our first segment for this week is going to be hitting on that, but it's more focused on looking at some of the online bot networks and disinformation networks that have been stood up and how they are reacting to this controversy really is what we want to kind of talk about today. So that's going to be one of the big topics, kind of diving into that, really looking at these bot networks, what they're set up for, how they've reacted in terms of this controversy. And then the second major topic that we want to cover this week, we've talked about the ongoing conflict in Gaza and the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation that was stood up to provide aid. It's a joint U.S.-Israeli endeavor that took over aid distribution from the UN. And so we've talked about that and killings that have taken place at those aid distribution centers. I think since our last topic on this, a retired U.S. Special Forces Army officer who had signed up as a contractor for the GHF has basically come out and essentially said that the U.S. and Israel are complicit in war crimes based off of how these aid distribution sites are set up, with video evidence backing up some of his claims. So we wanted to talk about that a little bit. There's been quite a few interviews with this individual. And so we wanted to show a little bit of one of those interviews and have some conversation around that and the narrative that's been spun up by the GHF to try and discredit this individual and why it doesn't make a ton of sense. But before we get into those really, uplifting topics.
The pivots are always so hard in this show.
I don't even know how to say there. But before we do that, let's talk to our hosts for this week. So, like mentioned at the prompt, we've got Joe this week and Noah Glick, our ally from the Ally. So, Joe, Noah, how are you guys doing this week? Anything you want to plug for the show up front, or anything going on that you want to bring up?
No, not a whole lot going on with me. I did want to plug the reading group for the podcast in case people want to read along with our next adventure. The book we're starting to discuss soon is called The Dawn of Everything. Looks like this. Subtitle, A New History of Humanity. Co-written by David Graeber and David Wingrove, an archaeologist and an anthropologist. One of them died in 2020, like 3 weeks after they finished writing the book together. But it's a really, really deep dive, as deep as you can imagine, into human history as a whole, like way before written languages that we have evidence of. We're talking like 10, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 years ago, even further back with some of the archaeological evidence that they're digging into and trying to construct a narrative about human history that really just kind of shakes your world a little bit when you're thinking about how you think about all of human history. So hopefully it'll help us open our perspectives up a little bit more and have more interesting conversations about what's going on today. It's always kind of hard to connect the crazy events that are happening right now to this big perspective of what we even are as a species, what we're doing here, what the point of any of it is. And so I think this book will help us make some of those connections in a more meaningful way. So excited to start reading and talking about that. I hope you guys will join us for that next book adventure.
Absolutely. And Joe, I don't remember if we asked or talked about this when we were talking about what books to read next. Have you read?
Yeah, I did.
Sapiens?
I read that several years ago. Yeah, it was solid.
Yeah, I haven't read the one that we're about to read, The Dawn of Everything. I've read Sapiens. I was just curious, like, are they complementary, or they don't really deal with the similar themes, or is it?
From what and it's been maybe 10 years since I've read Sapiens now, so my memory is kind of shaky on it. But that author is a historian by training, which really means that his primary material is narrative stories about human history, and that's kind of what he works with. The big difference for this book is that this is an archaeologist and an anthropologist who are more interested in looking at artifacts and then trying to understand what the meaning socially is of those artifacts, how they were used, what the stories around those artifacts can tell us. And so I think they just have different source material they're working with. Yeah, I feel like I remember reading a few critiques about Sapiens, but I don't remember anything specific about it, specific enough to say anything useful right now. But there was some reason for hesitating on Sapiens, but I would have to go back and look at all that stuff again to be sure. Main point that there's a historian in one case and then like archaeologists and anthropologists in the other case. So totally different kind of story they tell. Listened to this new book on tape once before, like a year or two ago, and was really fascinated by it. So this time, hopefully it'll be a more engaging read to actually read through the book itself.
Nice. Awesome. Yeah, definitely looking forward to getting that started. Noah, anything you want to plug up front or anything from you that you want to add in?
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to take it from the 3,000-foot view that Joe just went into super hyper local. But any listeners who heard last time I was on know that I'm the executive editor of the Sierra Nevada Ally, a community-based news and information educational outfit based in the Sierra Nevada region. So kind of that Sacramento, Tahoe, Reno sort of corridor. I just want to share a story that one of our Tahoe reporters covered for this last week that I think is really interesting. It's about a group of third graders who took time out of summer break to come and pitch the Truckee Town Council an idea to become a official bee city. There's a organization, the Xerxes Society, which works to help invertebrates throughout the country. They have what's called bee cities, and you can become an affiliate, an official affiliate, which means you have plans to essentially help pollinators in your community. You create a committee, etc. There's about 6 different requirements. Carson City, Nevada is one, for example. There's a town outside of Sacramento that is part of this. So this group of impassioned third graders came during their summer break to pitch the town council on this idea, and town council said no. So we wrote a piece on this, basically what goes into it. I should say that the town of Truckee said basically no right now. They didn't feel like it was appropriate for the town to take it on. It was more, they are suggesting they partner with a nonprofit to take that on. But anyway, it was just a really interesting piece. I know the kids were disappointed. The teacher was disappointed in that outcome, hoping to bring kids along to show them how government works and like you work hard and do the process. And, so there's a little bit of heartbreak involved, but it's also just an important kind of civics lesson that even cute third graders coming and making their pitch doesn't always guarantee that something's going to happen. So I would encourage anyone listening to check out that story. It's from our writer, Kayla Anderson. She's based in Tahoe, does a lot of great reporting for us. And anyone who's interested in that kind of work to check us out at sierranevadaally.org. And thanks for having me on the show, guys. Looking forward to it.
I would go so far as to say that those third graders learned exactly how government works.
Sometimes you got to learn a lesson the hard way, I suppose. But yeah, it was a very, it was a fun one to edit. But yeah, it's also, we had to stop ourselves from use of bee puns. So as an editor in that one, I had to get rid of quite a few of those. So, but we kept a couple. So, you pun lovers out there will still be happy.
Perfect. That sounds fantastic. Well, awesome. I think on my side, the only things that I kind of wanted to plug, we're recording this on August 3rd. So I think yesterday was another pretty large nationwide protest, the August 2nd Rage Against the Regime protests. I didn't see as much online for this one as like the No Kings. Like I have seen some pictures and whatnot going on there. But I think for the show, what I kind of wanted to plug in the next few months, we've had a bunch of meetings about what content we want to put together over the next few months and some of our deep dives. So don't have dates for these yet, but we are looking at doing some shows that deep dive into American propaganda and PR. I think we touched on this briefly, but we will be talking about Edward Bernays and how wartime propaganda of World War I and World War II essentially turned into the show Mad Men, but for real life, and how that transition occurred and how that's still, occurring in American society today. And then, we're probably going to have a couple conversations that are a little bit more reflective on, how masculinity is propagandized, weaponized. I don't know how you want to put it there, but how narratives are turned around masculinity in order to earn public opinion or change public action. And then also just, what we've learned over the last 3 months of doing this show. So those are some of the topics that we're going to be covering here over the next couple month or so. But yeah, I think that's the big thing I wanted to mention for the show. All right. So yeah, with that, let's jump into our first topic for this week. So there was an article that came out. This was actually let me see when this actual article is. It was on NBC News. This was from Kevin Collier. This was actually July 20th when this article came out. We didn't bring it into our other conversations around Epstein, but I think it's an interesting thing to learn about a little bit. And I'll just give a pretty high overview. I'm not going to read through this specific article, but what this is essentially about is a Clemson University research study that identified a large bot network. So when we say bot network, what we're actually talking about here is fake accounts that are being run by AI chatbots, essentially, on X, formerly known as Twitter, somewhere around 400 different identified accounts that were essentially set up to praise or provide praise for key figures in the Trump administration. The reason that this is relevant now is because what the researchers noted is that this bot network, when the Epstein controversy started to come up, and it was becoming clear that, this was becoming more and more of a story and it was becoming an issue for the administration, this bot network was kind of split in how it responded. You would literally have the same account posting both pro-Trump and then like, we need to burn down the whole administration in the same day. So there's a couple different accounts that I'm going to share here. Let me just share my screen so you guys can see. All right, cool. So just as an example, they're saying there's 400 different accounts. What the Clemson researchers basically said was that these specific accounts don't have a ton of followers in themselves. So, we talked a lot about like Russian disinformation in past episodes and how, it was a quantity over quality thing. They would just throw everything that they could at the wall to see, what sticks and grab onto those narratives and then try and promote those. It seems like, at least from the research from Clemson, what they're asserting is that most of these bot networks or the bots specifically in this network, are more to provide like boosting pro-narrative support for the administration in the comment section, vice trying to create like viral articles themselves. So it's more like, hey, let's bolster that echo chamber by providing positive comments about RFK or Pam Bondi or whoever else in the Trump administration. So it's more controlling the narrative from that side. The example here is like, yeah, if you go on, there's a viral news article on X or something, these would be a lot of the accounts that are in the comments pushing that conversation one way or the other. It's almost similar, Joe, to like what we talked about from some of the hijack hashtagging that activists have used. But in this scenario, it's the opposite, where it's AI bots doing this in support of the administration. So let me show you a couple of the different tweets specifically that they called out in this article from a couple of different users. This first one, I don't even know what this is. I'm Marybell, I think is what this one's called, followed by a 5053. S Marybell 5053 is the account name. Most of the accounts all have the 4-digit numbers at the end, so just like kind of a generic whatever's created when you create your X account. But from July 12th, this tweet was from July 12th at 6:36 a.m., and it basically says, everyone has their own opinion, but remember to stay open-minded and gather as much information as possible before forming any conclusions about anyone's involvement in a situation. The hashtags here were Epstein, Trump, and Bondi. And so at the same time, it was like a reply that this one had said, I agree, if Pam Bondi doesn't resign, then Dan Bondingo, I'm using the full name for the Twitter @ here, and Kash Patel should also step down and publicly apologize on the Joe Rogan Experience. Let's demand accountability for all individuals involved. That was actually the exact same time on the same day that those two replies or tweets were actually coming from this account. Another similar situation here where we've got this guy, supposedly Elijah Teagues, I guess is that name. So I did go and click on these links, and there's like, they have like no posts themselves. These are all like replies to different chains here. And so his first one on July 9th was, Attorney General Pam Bondi comes out clean as the DOJ confirms no Epstein client list is found while reaffirming his death by suicide. So that was July 9th when that was posted. July 18th, the same account posted, retweet if you believe that Trump and his cronies are lying to the public and treating us like we're stupid. We won't be fooled by their games. Trump lies, Epstein files, no Bondi. These accounts that are likely being run by large language models that have some sort of prompt up behind the scenes, it seems like they're not quite sure which narrative to take, or whoever's running these accounts, like how they've trained them to reply, isn't accounting for this big kind of split in the MAGA base right now on the messaging. So it's an interesting thing to see, right? And my my whole point of like bringing this up and what I want to talk about here is a couple different things. One, it's interesting to see how the technology at this point fails for AI technology when there is a significant fracture narratively in the base. And using some of these technologies, like it doesn't have the level of control so that who's running these networks can make sure that they're all staying on point because they're taking training from other MAGA accounts. And a lot of MAGA supporters right now are pretty upset about the entire situation and still demanding this client list. So that's just an interesting thing into talking about the technology itself. But then the other piece of this is, if this type of technique is being used, continuing to be used on the right to promote this administration with basically no recourse, especially on platforms like X, where Elon Musk controls this and has basically shut down any of the,
The community notes.
sorry, I'm completely blanking on the name. They had a specific name for their, anyway, I'll remember it, or I'll just
What did they
edit that
do?
in.
What was the purpose of the thing they shut down?
Content moderators. There we go. Jesus Christ. Their content moderation team. Oh, thank you, Joe. Yeah, so basically shut down all of that beforehand. So like there's no recourse, I guess is what I'm saying, right? Like this can just go on and who's going to stop it? And by not providing the actual access to the data to identify it, making it more difficult. So if this is something that, I guess my question here, or my thought is, if this is something that's going to continue to be used, is this something that I guess those on the left or more left-leaning or more pro-democracy should be looking at using these same type of bot networks in a positive way that could even be open about how they're using it, right? We openly use these bots to push pro-democratic or pro-democracy things. I'm just like thought exercise here, right? What do you guys think? Those are kind of the two main areas that I wanted to talk about is technology. What do we think about how it's breaking down? And then two, is this a technique that you think others should try to use?
My first question, I guess, is as you were talking through the story, I was curious how the research about bot networks, you mentioned this NBC News report is a summary of a Clemson research effort. And I was looking through the article and I couldn't find a link to the research anywhere because I always, I don't know. I don't really trust news organizations to always do a good job explaining research. They find like the most juicy bit in the research article and then they turn it into drinking warm water burns more calories or something. And maybe, yeah, that's true, but like, are people really going to drink warm water to burn calories? It's just a way of sensationalizing research that might be more boring than the way the news presents it. It's how the bot research specifically works. Like, how do they first identify and confirm in some way what the bot accounts are, and maybe the two tweets you mentioned from that one account that were posted at the exact same time is kind of like evidence of a bot activity. And then what's the tracking like? How do they collect additional data about the bots? Yeah, just how does the research work in general? I was interested in that. So yeah, maybe I'll just leave it there and see what you say.
Sure. Yeah. And so like for this one, I agree. Like I was trying to go back to the actual Clemson University study on this. I didn't find that one. I'd have to probably go to Clemson's University Media Forensics Hub, I guess is the place that does a lot of their studying for disinformation research. What I've seen before, like some of the other organizations that do this, it's looking at accounts like heuristically, like trying to see when these accounts were created, if you have accounts that are all created at the same time, if they've stayed dormant for a similar amount of time. So it's looking for characteristics across all these different accounts that are very similar to include like the type of content that they talk about, that they tweet about, that they push, along with like the different hashtags that they're actually using. So that's part of it, looking for when they're created, the type of information that they're actually pushing, the type of, do they actually do posts or are they doing just replies into comment sections, the narratives that they're actually trying to push. And then I think the other piece that had been taken into account before was like how profiles are set up. Do they have like all of their pictures? Are the account names like unique? Do they have like people interacting with them, or are they only interacting like with others or like initiating conversations with them? So those are the kind of different things that a lot of the organizations have looked for. One of the things, Joe, that you said there is like, how do they get the information for this? There's another article that I think I leaked to. It's actually this one, the Reuters article here, but it's actually gotten a lot more difficult to do this type of research, especially on X, because they have limited access to the types of data sets that they would actually need to be able to do what I just talked about. They don't get the same, here's a dump of all the tweets from the back end for the last year, which is kind of the level of analysis that you would need to really identify large scale networks, because you're not looking at account X, right? Like, I'm not going to, like, this account is this specific account, like trying to identify, is this a bot account? And then going to account, or account A and then account B and then account C. It's more like, let's look for common patterns across 10,000 different accounts. And then let's group those different accounts into these buckets. And then we'll see, like, oh yeah, do we think that these like 500 accounts that are all acting very similarly are part of a bot network or not? And then, like, to go a step further, if you had access to data as far as like where were these accounts registered initially, like then you could probably get into like, did they all come from a VPN when they were created? Did they all come from a specific country? From a data level that could actually help with you identifying if they're bot counts or not. Please stay tuned for a word from our sponsors.
Whoa, is my MAGA feed calling Trump both a savior and Epstein's golf buddy?
That's just what happens when you skip your Obey patch updates, bro.
Introducing MAGA Mode 2.0, now with contradiction suppression and emotional override. When the facts hurt, we harmonize your hatred.
But, aren't contradictions bad?
Now when we boost engagement, MAGA mode doesn't fix the narrative, it yields the narrative.
Obey, turning confusion into community.
Side effects include memory fragmentation, reality bleeding, and QAnon reactivation.
I was just going to say, too, I think it's worth noting in the NBC News article, it does kind of address that a little bit, Joe, with that, it says that the researchers declined to share specifics on how they identified the accounts. But basically, they're looking for a set of characteristics. And specifically, it looked like these accounts that they identified were all created around the same 3 days, and that the accounts themselves are only they're posting exclusively by replying, as Cody was kind of saying before too. And so, I think it sounds like, and I don't want to get into the world of speculation too much, but it sounds like they really are just kind of looking at like who is responding to all of this like commentary that's happening on X, and are there stories? It looks like they found such account to the researchers themselves specifically. Yeah, it's hard to say. And I hear you. Coming from it is, we have a tendency to kind of take the juiciest bit of research and try to blow it up. You just got to ask yourself, what's the kind of academic rigor that's behind it, or what's the methodology being used? And so, at least happy to see that they address that somewhat up in the story. But yeah, there's definitely the question there. I think the bigger thing that brings up for us in our conversation is, what can people do when they are on social media or online? What are the commonalities that they can look for? Really tell themselves like, oh, this could be a bot, or this is likely a bot. I mean, this article gets into some of that. The posting exclusively by replying to other users. I mean, having the string of numbers after a username is always kind of a giveaway. Not to say, there are some real folks who do that as well. But if you've got like 5 numbers afterwards, it's created by a bot just trying to build up usernames quickly. But yeah, I mean, always check to see how long has this profile been around, and are they posting everywhere, or is this like their only post? It's only replies and it's only to MAGA type content. Like, you just gotta ask yourself these questions, and it's not, and that's not, that's not only on kind of right wing conversations on X. It's also on Reddit, it's on Blue Sky, it's on anywhere that you go. You've got to, kind of just be aware of that. And I think, I think, Cody, I think you introduced this question at the beginning, this idea of like, well, should the left be kind of also be thinking about these tools and these tactics to kind of combat some of this? And, I think a big part of it for me is trying to just be really aware of what kind of content you're even engaging with online, and really limiting your use of some of these tools or some of these platforms. Like, social media at its core, and the internet at its core, has the ability to connect people. And, like, that's how I met you guys. Like, there's potential for real, true human interaction and connection. But just like any other tool, there's also a dark side to it. You have to be aware of and try to understand, like, the internet is a tool. It doesn't have to be life. I don't know. I don't want to get too philosophical, especially with Arthur not here. He could probably weigh in more on that. But I think it's, I think it's a good idea to really just all of us to rethink our use of the internet and tools. Like, we have the Propaganda Loves You book club. I mean, that's a great way to use the internet in a positive way where you can connect with people, but also then stay rooted in something that's based in research and rigor. As opposed to, you're not, I mean, yes, bots can make books. That's true. AI can make books, but generally speaking, like you call kind of what that is, use your library spaces to connect with people, find truly vetted information. I think, this is kind of the world we're in now. It's an information war that's out there, and we have to make sure that we're engaging with stuff that is reliable and stuff that's valuable. So that way, those are the things that continue to get created. So I know that's easier said than done, but I mean, for me personally, like I've done all I can to like get rid of most social media. And just recognizing that there's a lot of value in just staying involved in your community in a real life, in-person kind of situation, and limiting your online uses to sort of more focused, more intentional kind of practices, right? If you're looking for a group about a specific topic that you want to talk about, then find that out. But spending your days doom scrolling on your phone, easier said than done to not do that. But the more that we're all able to do that, I think the more power we're able to kind of take away from some of these platforms. If X were to somehow lose all of its people and it was bots just talking to each other, what would that do to its value? Which leads me to a little bit of a question on that idea. Are you familiar with the dead internet theory? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I don't know. I'm always fascinated by that. I know it's not true, but it's funny for anyone who doesn't know. The dead internet theory is this idea that nobody's actually on the internet anymore and that it's just bots talking to each other. But then you see stories like this where it is essentially bots talking to each other. It's kind of hard to not buy into them ways in some areas. But I think for me, going back to the idea, I'd love to hear what you guys think about the idea of should the left or kind of resistance movement, should they be using similar tools? Like, I don't know. I'm of the mindset, I think the more people that walked away from this kind of stuff, the more power that would be taken away from some of these tools. But, I don't know how practical it is. I'd just be curious to know your guys' thoughts.
Yeah, I like everything you said there. And I'm trying to tie it back to, Cody, your original questions about should the left or resistance groups start using this, but also this whole idea of just whether or not you're talking to a robot online is just an increasingly real thing people have to worry about. It's in movies all over the place. It has been in sci-fi for a long time, but now it's more of a present day reality. There's a guy Katie told me about that she saw on TikTok who is like, he got a new job, but it's a remote job and all the work is done through Slack, all the coordination and everything. And he's pretty convinced that all of his bosses are AI robots. They have names in the Slack channel and like a profile image, and he has to check in with them and everything. But based on all the interactions he has with them so far, he's been in this job for a few months, I think. It's pretty clear that they're robots he's working for, and his job is actually to train them in like managerial tactics and stuff. And he kind of got tricked into this job, he feels like. So it's like actually happening in people's lives. Like you might get tricked into thinking you're having
That's
a
a
human
movie I would
interaction when
watch,
it's actually a
though.
robot.
If
I
that
was
sounds
thinking about
It's
that.
almost like Severance or something,
Right? Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy. But yeah, I was thinking about the platforms too, and you guys were talking about just how important it is to be aware of the kind of account you're engaging with and like different signs you can look to figure out whether it's a robot or not. The purely text-based social media are perhaps the most dangerous, right? Because with the language models, that's the easiest way to fake a human interaction if it's just text. With a platform like TikTok, the convention is to show your human face while you're talking at the same time. And that's requires a lot more energy and infrastructure and technology to fake it. There's still some fakes on TikTok with the videos and like you kind of get a weird outline around the head sometimes. You're like, is that a real person or is that a bot or something? But again, it's just a little bit harder to fake in that way. But yeah, I mean, that technology is here. And I think to your dead internet theory question, it's really a question of what percentage of the internet is already dead. And how quickly is that ratio shifting away from real people? I don't know. But yeah, it's something we're already having to deal with. And the thing about this ethical question you're posing is, are there good uses for this kind of technology? I always go back to what's the infrastructure, who owns it, who controls it. Like you're saying, Noah, with Twitter, I think the better strategy is just to starve Twitter of attention completely. And the more people shift to like Blue Sky and stop using Twitter, the more that problem goes away. If there's any way to have a social media that has like an open source distributed way of managing it, so that it's not some hedge fund that just makes all the decisions, but there's actually some sort of democratic board of editors and content moderators and all kinds of stuff. That would be an interesting conversation to have. Until we have that infrastructure in a meaningful way, it's really whoever controls each individual platform is going to dictate how it gets used. And you can even see, I always go back to TikTok because it's a fascinating sort of platform experiment, but just to see how much people's experience on that app has changed since its ownership has moved around with litigations over the last couple of years. How much more catered toward an American Western audience the platform is in general versus what it used to be a few years ago. It's just interesting to watch how the ownership shifting changes the user's direct experience, to think about why that is.
I've also looked at, this idea of Twitter and X being as popular as it is a direct result of the media propping it up as part of everyday coverage, right? I don't think there's a day that goes by where you can't get into, and I mean, we're using NBC News as an example of it's a reliable source. I'm not trying to paint all media in a broad brush here, but how often do you look for just general news coverage and you'll be talking about a topic and it's like, well, what are they saying on X? This person posts on this platform. So the media has a role to play in terms of kind of propping up the value of these platforms and encouraging engagement in some ways, because subconsciously they're telling you to be a part of the conversation. If you get on these platforms and start tweeting about this stuff, maybe you'll be on the news. It's a bigger issue than just having users leave the platform, because there's an infrastructure in place already where you've got media reports saying like, well, what are they saying on social media? There's tools and analytics software that's built primarily to judge sentiment on social media. So these are all things that institutions are looking at regularly and encouraging engagement on. And so, everyone just leaving and going to Blue Sky, it might eventually take root, but those things take a long time to actually flourish. It's why I continue to go back to really thinking about your usage of any of this, not just social media, but kind of the mass media enterprise as well. The focus on more independent media that is a little more transparent with where they're getting their information, I think is really important, especially today. And that's not to say, again, NBC is totally fine, reliable. They've got their biases and slants as well. I think it's worth noting here. I wanted to bring this up at some point. I didn't know a good spot to, but it's interesting. So NBC News, this story on like cybersecurity and this sort of beat. I remember Ben Collins was the reporter who used to cover this for NBC, and he is now the CEO of The Onion. So I just find it interesting that the sort of like through line, because him and his colleague, and I'm forgetting her name, it's Brandy something, I'm forgetting her last name, I apologize, but they had the conspiracy theory reporting back in like 2017 and the like. And I know Ben worked for like the Daily Beast and then worked for NBC. And that's kind of how I came about him. And so when I saw that he was running The Onion, I was like, wait, the guy who like specialized in legitimate journalism around conspiracy theories and the rise of like QAnon and what we're talking about today is now the head of The Onion, which is like this satirical website, which I mean, reality is it reads more and more like an Onion headline every day. So I just thought that was an interesting sort of through line for his career. But it's interesting to me. I think, again, I'll just kind of put a pin on it here from my perspective, but just being really thoughtful about what you're using these platforms for. They're all meant to get you hooked, like whether it's Instagram or TikTok or Reddit or any of these, even if it's a quote unquote good platform, it's still at the end of the day trying to hook you and keep your attention on these platforms. I'm guilty of it as well. I spend too much time scrolling on my phone much more than I'd like to admit. But trying to remind yourself of like, where's the actual value here? It's like eating your vegetables, it's not always the most fun thing to do, but sometimes you want to make sure that you're not just eating the junk, you're eating the good stuff too. So have fun, do your social media stuff, feel free to scroll. Like there's nothing wrong with engaging in these platforms, but just also remember like where the good stuff is and try to find those things as well and support those when you're able as well. I mean, ultimately all those actions can help reduce the power that these platforms have.
Should add that guy to the A-list interview guest, hopeful, whatever. That would be a really cool conversation. But yeah, The
Yeah.
Onion is so on point with the news these days. Like it's just the difference between reality and the satire, which really underscores the point of their whole operation. But yeah, that's fascinating.
Well, it's interesting too, just, from a media perspective, basically what you always hear as a reporter, what you hear from your editor is we need, a real person who's experiencing this problem. Like, right. So if there's a study that came out or some statistics that are interesting, what your editor will be like is like, this is a story, but let's find someone who this is affecting. Right. And that's the crux of all media is like, okay, here's a person. And what they've done with the rise of social media is you just use that as your sourcing for people who are experiencing things. And so, you in some ways, like there's still fact checking that needs to happen, but in today's like quick to publish world, that doesn't always happen. It's like, so like, let's just crowdsource this to social media and see like who's experiencing this problem with rising healthcare costs. Here's a Reddit thread of people who's talking about it, and they just kind of take it at face value. And so it also helps to kind of feed the propaganda that's happening on these platforms as well, especially for media folks who aren't trained to find these bots or to be aware of these bots. So, it's a lesson for all of us, not just consumers of media, but also media practitioners to just be aware and to take time and to slow down. I think it's really hard today to slow down, but it's more and more important, possibly more important than ever, to actually slow down and question things as much as you're able.
Please stay tuned for a word from our sponsors. You ever feel like the internet's just off?
Like someone's been typing for your Uncle Ted? Yeah.
Introducing FreedomBot by Deceive America Pack, your 100% American sleeper AI programmed to seed ideology gently, lovingly, and permanently into digital discourse.
We embed patriotic narratives in your feeds now, so when the truth breaks later, your audience breaks harder.
But what if the bots start arguing with each other, like over Epstein?
Great news, that's an upgrade. Internal narrative collapse drives up engagement 200%. 2 bots, 1 civil war. Let's ride.
FreedomBot. It's not propaganda, it's pre-loyalty.
FreedomBot is funded by anonymous donors, may induce contradictory posts, belief erosion, or brief moments of clarity.
I think I agree with everything that both of you guys are saying, like from a personal level, like just, what people should do, right? Like, or not necessarily telling people what they should do, but just what people should think about as they're interacting with these platforms. But I guess the way that I look at this problem is that it may be a little bit differently. When I think, and actually, Noah, you said it, we're in an information war, right? I think like, so one of the things that I've seen online quite a bit in a number of different subreddits, so like the 5051, People's Press, like all of these different, like a lot of the kind of like organizing subreddits, is a vitriol against anything AI. Like if you got an AI poster or something in there, the first comment is usually AI slop, like get rid of that, or can we ban AI from this thing? And I get that from I think from just a, like, again, at that personal level, like if you don't want to support those companies that are promoting AI, or you don't want to support a technology that we don't have very clear guidelines or like research identifying like how this affects the environment, I understand like that argument 100%. But for me, again, it goes back to like, oh, sorry. And the other comment that I've seen a few times, and I just like, I scratch my head a little bit, and I feel like they're using this incorrectly, is the, you can't use the weapons of the master, like that. You heard that like before, like you can't use the master's weapons, like, and whatnot.
Master's tools to dismantle the master's house. Something
There
like
you
that.
go. Yeah. And I think like in this situation, right, the way that a lot of the right wing, or really the more fascistic fascistic, whatever. The more fascist wing of this is like they look at this as a war, like an actual culture war, sure, but like a war for the direction of where the U.S. is going, and they're going to use whatever tools they can in order to win that war. And so, like, if you're not looking at this the same way, I mean, this is a crude comparison, but it's almost like saying if you were in a hot civil war, right? Well, we can't use weapons in this scenario because that's what the master uses, right? Like we can't use those to dismantle this. And it's like, oh, you can't use guns or anything like that. If you're in a hot civil war, that civil war is not going to go very well for you, whichever side you're on. And if you translate that directly to like an information war, these are the weapons of an information war. And so if you're not willing to learn how to use these things and use them in a way to counter some of what's going on online, then you're essentially ceding that ground. You're giving them or whoever it is you're saying is on the other side. You're basically ceding all of that to them and allowing them to use these very, very powerful tools in a way to manipulate public perception without seeing how do we use those same tools to counteract that. And like where my head goes, like, okay, what if there was a massive pro Pete Buttigieg bot army that stood up on Twitter tomorrow, right? Like, let's just say that like, I'm just throwing this out there. It's like, oh, Pete's going to be the 2028 candidate or something like that. And it's like, 1,000 different accounts. They're posting on everything. How quickly do you think that would be shut down by Elon Musk? Or how quickly do you think that the rhetoric will come out and be like, oh, this crazy bot network, like supporting these candidates, like they're not real people. We need to shut it down. And so it's almost two things, right? Like you could find a way to use this technology in a way that fights back and isn't subversive, like isn't saying like, oh, I'm a real person posting this, but it's like legit. Like, I don't know how we would do that just yet. I'm still trying to figure it out. Or if you use the exact same tactics, you can highlight the hypocrisy because they're going to shut it down or try to shut it down right away. I guess that's where my head's going, is like, if we look at this as an actual war, like, which it kind of is in a sense, does that change the framing of how you would use kind of these tools?
Yeah, there's a lot going on here to unpack. There's the metaphor of the war is one thing to think about, and we could sort of set up the different terms of that metaphor and what they correspond to. There's also the metaphor of the tools and dismantling the house. I see what your point is about being frustrated by that saying. I've had a similar thought before. I think it comes down to what's the specific tool you're talking about. You can use a hammer to build a house, and if you're thorough and patient, you could probably use a hammer to tear down a house. It might take you a while, but you could do it. So it depends on what the tool is specifically. On the warfare thing, I feel like it gets messier because when we think about warfare, we like to have clearly delineated sides. There are these guys versus those guys. There are clear camps and everything. And I'm not sure, it was sort of a hypothetical perspective. You were saying you could do this or you could do that, meaning whoever the team is on the opposite side of the fascist power in place right now. I don't have access to that tool. You know what I mean? I don't control a bot farm. I don't know anybody that controls a bot farm. I don't know anybody that has the infrastructure to set up a bot farm. So as far as any resistance groups using bot farms to counteract the force of fascism, I'm not part of that conversation. That's not part of the groups that I'm in, So it's sort of like indulging a conversation about what to do with your yacht. I don't have a yacht. I don't know. I don't really care. You know what I mean? So like, I'm not going to do anything with a yacht. So that's kind of yacht owner's problem to deal with. You know what I mean? So that's just kind of my resistance to the hypothetical, is like, that's not my problem to worry about because I don't foresee myself being in charge of a bot army anytime soon.
I think interesting framing though, in both sort of metaphors though. I think it's an interesting sort of thought experiment to go through. I mean, when you were talking about the war metaphor, Cody, and kind of the idea of like, well, if you've heard the phrase, you don't bring a knife to a gunfight, right? Or what I was thinking of is the the Revolutionary War. One of the big knocks against the British Army then was they were engaged in traditional warfare of the time, whereas the American Revolutionary Army was very much engaging in guerrilla warfare, hiding in trees and ambushing them, and they weren't ready for that. They didn't know how to. And so, in this context of war, it's like you have to be willing and able to try different things that, maybe aren't seen in sort of the, it kind of, to me, it goes like when we're talking about this information framework, it's that idea of like decorum, which is what you see a lot on the left is, well, we want to engage in debate with our counterparts on the right, but we want to maintain decorum. And, so the criticism of that is like, well, you can't argue civilly with people who are just interested in tearing down the structure, right? So, you see it in many different ways. I think to go to your point, Joe, is like, what's the tool then that we're using, right? I mean, there's political tools at play. You see the gerrymandering underway in Texas, further gerrymandering, I should say, to try to drum up more Republican House seats. Threats from California Governor Newsom to do the same in California for Democratic seats. So it's like, I think there's an appetite for some people on the left or in the resistance, if you will, to kind of play in the mud a little bit and to at least see something. So I think that's where you're coming from, Cody, is it's like, look, these AI bots and this technology is already out there. Why not at least get out there and try something and see what happens, And who knows, maybe there's something underway. I don't know. I haven't seen it as it's widespread or as prevalent in my experience. So I think there is an appetite of those on the left to say like, well, what are you actually doing to fight against this? That goes beyond holding up a sign during the State of the Union, right? Of, I disagree cordially. And it's how are you going to play dirty? How are you going to engage in some guerrilla warfare here? I think, that said, I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a yes and kind of proposition here. I think, yes, there's an opportunity for groups to build up AI bots. I'm also not in that world, Joe, so I can't say what's being done or what I would do because that's not my bag. And, maybe there's work underway with that. But also maybe some of that know-how is being deployed in other ways that we don't even know yet, right? Like, I think of like Anonymous. Maybe there's something that they're cooking right now. Who knows with that group? And who that's just going to be another ominous video with nothing coming after. But there could be stuff going. But there's also, I think, other areas in which you're seeing organizing. I'm reminded of frequently. It's a conversation I had with a dear friend of mine. Before Trump took office for his second term, we were talking about the rise of fascism and how do you fight fascism? And she told me, and this sticks with me a lot, is the best way to fight fascism is through community. Because if we're united, then they can't divide us. And that sticks with me a lot. That, and there's another quote not a quote, but another thing a colleague told me once, a journalism colleague of mine, who said, when there is misunderstanding around an issue, it's an opportunity to drive a wedge between people. And so keeping that in mind, I think what I've done is I try to focus my work in like this podcast, what our work we do with the Sierra Nevada Ally, in trying to help people better understand the information that's out there. Because the more understanding we have, the more likely it is that we can at least agree on some semblance of facts to keep us united. So that way we're not fighting against each other. I think this might be an opportunity too to talk about some of the psychology of the MAGA movement and the Epstein files, to bring it back, because there was an article in Huffington Post or HuffPost. I linked in the show notes kind of right before we started recording, but I just want to read this because I think it's really interesting. We talked about this a little bit. This is a quote from, it looks like his name is Steve K.D. Eichel. He's a psychologist who studies cults and other cultic relationships. And he said in this HuffPost article, when we look at the MAGA hardcore, we typically see the pathological othering of two specific classes of people, immigrants and, quote, sex perverts. And so he goes on later to talk about how, like, research shows that, homophobes typically see gay people more often than what they actually exist. And just like anti-Semites also see Jewish people more often than they actually exist. It's this idea of, it's almost like, you never see a Honda Civic and then you buy a Honda Civic and every car you see now is a Honda Civic. So whenever it's top of mind, like that's just what you look for. I feel like I'm a little all over the place here, but I mean, there's a lot of sort of threads that come up to me in this conversation. It's, to fight the war against the rise of fascism or to use the tools, if you will, to kind of fight this misinformation. To me, it always comes back to community. And it goes back to my earlier point about doing what you can to like be intentional when you're online, but then also build a community in real life and talk face to face with people, join a group, even if it's like a sports group or a completely unrelated to the topics of the day. You don't have to talk about politics all the time, but just talk to people. Get to know your neighbors, like knock on your neighbor's door. Say, hey, what's going on? I'm this person. Like, let's have dinner one day. Let's just chat, like come over and play a board game. I'm big into board games. I think that's a great way to build community and friendship. Come over and we'll have a game night. I think those little acts, as small as they may seem, are acts of hope for the future and acts of resistance. You're not going to break up my community no matter what. Like, I'm not going to let AI bots on Twitter disrupt my community here. And I think the more that people do that and lean into their own little micro communities, then the stronger that we can be, as people. And again, I'm getting really philosophical here today, but this stuff really, it all kind of stems into this idea of how do you live your life and how do you continue to build connection with each other as humans? I think that's ultimately what's going to fight most of this. And I'd like to think that's kind of where the left and resistance in history tends to do a good job of, but you've seen that sort of rise of community on the right in recent times. And so how do we kind of combat that and think of everything that we're doing as community? Even this podcast, the book club, community, these conversations are building community around. You don't have to agree with everything we say. In fact, I would encourage people not to agree with everything we say and question things we say. But at the end of the day, what are we trying to do? We're trying to build community and trying to at least start a conversation where everyone's welcome to join in.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. Two like core principles really stuck out in what you were saying there, and you explained community a good deal in a way that's really helpful. But I also thought clarity. I thought those two things, clarity and community, were sort of core values that stuck out in what you were saying. So like, yes, everything, echo and support everything you're saying about community. And in terms of it being inevitable that we are online and that we are influencing one another online and how we post and how we consume and how we comment and respond, whatever, clarity should be the intention. Whatever we do should increase understanding and, a basic groundwork or framework for understanding the world. The more clarity we can bring to our communities, the more we'll trust one another, the better those communities will be. Just a point about community. It's more than just conversation too. A community in a meaningful way provides things that people need, right? Whether that's ideally material resources, like if you and your community can provide all the food that is needed in your community, you're an incredibly independent and resilient community, right? But even on a social level, we need things socially from one another. We need to feel connected to community. And that's also a big part of what we provide, to make people feel less alone, to make people feel like they have someone they can talk to if they're confused about the world. They want to just sort of talk things out. The conversations are super important. The more and more we can direct communities to being self-sufficient in greater and greater ways, I think the stronger they'll be. Yeah, who cares about AI if your whole neighborhood has what it needs already? You don't have to go outside the neighborhood to get what you need. Like, you're strong, you're good.
I think that's a really point, Joe. It's not just the social component of it. That's how I tend to think of it, but you're right. It's also about the the material needs and proving what people need. I read an interesting article. I'll see if I can find it and link it, but this was years ago, talking about the idea though of building community through, I'm gonna get the term wrong, but something like micro interactions. And the idea was, if you go to the same coffee shop every morning, that barista who makes your coffee is part of your community, whether or not like you recognize it in the moment, but like that person is part of your community. Whoever cuts your hair, like that's part of your community. The people you see on the train or as you're walking through the neighborhood, like every day, like those people are in your community. Even if all you do is maybe give them a little nod or a wave, like you may not know their names, but they're part of your community and that you feel connected in some ways. So like the more that people, and this is why I keep coming back to this idea of like just getting out away from the internet sometimes. It's good to check in with your online community. Also really, really important to check in with your in real life community and making sure that your neighbors are taken care of, like you said. And I would argue it's more important to check in with your in real life community first before checking in with your online community. But that, I think they both serve a purpose, and it's just important to kind of make sure that you understand what those purposes are and making sure that you're approaching your community in a mindset of what can you do to contribute, rather than like what are you getting out of it, right? And I don't want to harp too much on this idea of community, but I do think it's really important in the conversation in the context of what we're talking about with fighting misinformation and fighting this idea of propaganda. It really is building strong communities wherever you are.
I completely agree. I think long term, that's the thing that's going to move us hopefully past the situation that we're in right now. It's like, well, I'm just going to speak in generalities for a second, but like if over the next couple of years, everybody that's not happy with the direction that the United States is going right now goes out and gets very involved with their communities and starts to do the things to actually make everyone's life around them a little bit better, whether that's from, just like you said, organizing a small get together on Fridays or whatever those small things are that actually make the lives of everyone around you better. Even if that's just like, hey, let's form some sort of neighborhood mutual aid society where so-and-so's house got flooded, right? Okay, let's start the phone tree. Let's call. Let's go help this person. Things like that are what would move us past current climate that we're in, because then you actually have tangible, like, this group of people helped me. And, oh, wait, those people are democratic socialists, or they're like, whatever. Like, I've always heard that they're akin to Satan, and yet they came and helped me when I needed it. So I agree. I think that's that in the long term is what would kind of build the base that would be needed. I think where my head's at in the short term with this other piece is like the online community, I think, became much more important over COVID. And that's really what the online community is, what drove, I think, a lot of the success that, Trump and team has had, right? Like that engagement online and that, that influencing of the online conversation, I think, is what helped get us to this point. And I might cut this out, but I did want to mention it. Like did you guys ever see the QAnon? It was like Road to Q or something. HBO did a documentary on QAnon. The whole okay. Anyway, one thing that was in there, it's an interesting documentary. Maybe we should watch that and have that be like a reflect on or something. Like we could do an episode just talking about like that. But one of the things in there was talking about General Flynn, if you guys know all of his background and whatnot. So in 2004 to 2007, he was the director of intelligence for the Joint Special Operations Command. He was the senior intelligence officer for the Joint Special Operations Command for the United States. And then he went on to become the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. One of the things that he talked about a lot leading up to 2016 and beyond was the digital warriors, the online warriors and whatnot. His whole brain is really interesting. Like, the reason I bring him up is because there's people like him, or him specifically, and people like him that look at the online field of battle, right? They look at that as the next big area that they need to fight the war on, essentially. And like Steve Bannon has said the same thing, right? For years, he's been talking, it's like war room with Steve Bannon. So I guess that's where my head was going in the short term, like ceding that ground to those people. I feel like that's just not an option, because it's clearly been successful for them to some extent. Now, like I said, I agree that long-term community build up and everything like that is the way to get past kind of the situation we're in now. But I just wanted to mention, like, that's why my head is thinking about this more, is just like, I think it's proved effective.
Yeah, and I don't think that the two things are necessarily unrelated. I think the success of a lot of what you're talking about, of fascists and people in power using bots, using digital warfare broadly to influence people and influence their belief systems and everything. You see like QAnon and different kinds of conspiracy cults pop up. That takes place or is able to flourish so well in part because people in general are starved of community, because we live in food deserts, because we don't know our neighbors, because everybody's flipping houses and trying to get on to the next better thing as soon as they can. And like there's a reason that basically any revolutionary group you study, the Black Panthers is a great example, why they go to mutual aid, why one of the main things that they do is mutual aid. You can read up about the food lunch program in Chicago that the Black Panthers did. And like every revolutionary group goes to mutual aid. The more you can directly take care of the needs of a community, powerful institutions can't really do anything about that community because it has what they need. The more that the community needs to go outside, to go to institutions, to go to corporations, to go to the government for their basic needs, the less resilient they are, the less strong they are. So part of the theory, revolutionarily speaking, of mutual aid is to create communities that don't need institutions, that don't need corporations, that don't need some big capital D daddy government to take care of them. They're a strong community that can take care of themselves. And so I think they're actually really related problems, that the digital warfare thing will become increasingly silly as communities become increasingly strong, if that makes sense.
I like that framing. And I'll just add this to wrap up my thoughts, but I agree. I think it's both things. There's an opportunity for both, I guess, here. And I think what you're saying, Cody, is we can't, there can't the complete ceding of the digital space and just walking away completely. I'm thinking of there was a podcast, Behind the Bastards, with Andrew Tate, an Andrew Tate episode about how he weaponized these digital warriors, if you will. He basically would pay these folks to spend their days creating pro Andrew Tate content that would then get disseminated online. So there's obviously a strength. It's obviously a tactic that works, being online and their ability to influence in that space. And we see that. I mean, most people, even myself included, what's the first thing you do if you have a question or want to find something? You Google something, right? Like, you don't start by well, let me go to the library. That's not the first step for most people, right? And so, we have to recognize the reality that we're in and the influence and the powers that are at play here. But yeah, the more that we're able to share really important information, I keep thinking back to the small scale communities. Like, if we all can teach each other how to garden, how to can food, these are skills that could become very important with the economic headwinds we see. But the more that we're able to do knowledge sharing as part of that community is important too. But there shouldn't be appetite to just walk away from the digital world completely or to do nothing. So I do think it's both. I think in the short term, it'd be interesting. I'd be interested to see what the left or revolutionary groups are doing in that space, while also understanding that I think community is also the long-term play.
This is where I wish we had like a 20-year-old on this podcast, because I feel like that perspective would be really helpful. Just because I think maybe it's like, what's your strengths, right? Like, maybe your strength is building community online, right? Like, maybe that's something that you're good at, and hey, use that strength to make that and then promote, offline activity too, right? But yeah, I would be interested in hearing what a 20-year-old thinks, like someone that kind of grew up through COVID, right? Like, that was like their experience for some of their early adult life, right? Where online was the only community option that you had at that
If you're a
point
20-year-old listening to this, please get in touch. I want to hear from you.
Comment under this on Reddit.
Hit us up in the comments.
Tell us why we're wrong. That's it for this week's episode. Thanks so much for listening and hanging out with us.
If you enjoy the show, help us spread the word. Leave a rating, a review, and share it with your friends, family, or anyone you think would get something out of these conversations.
Your ratings, reviews, and shares help this show grow, and the more people listening, the harder it is for propaganda to win.
So until next time,
Stay aware, stay safe, and remember,
propaganda loves you.